At first glance, addiction may appear as nothing more than a failure of will, a bad habit born of weakness, something that should be conquered through discipline and choice. But to view it this way is not just an oversimplification, it is a profound misjudgment of the soul's deeper cry. Carl Jung, whose life's work explored the vast terrain of the unconscious, perceived addiction not as a defect of character, but as a symbol, an anguished, misguided attempt to restore wholeness in a psyche torn from its spiritual roots. Beneath every compulsion, every dependency, every self-destructive act, Jung saw an inner fracture, the gap between the fragmented self and the yearning for reunion with something greater, something sacred. To Jung, the addict was not merely a weak-willed individual, but a soul estranged from its own center, desperately seeking contact with the numinous, the divine spark that gives life its orientation and depth. All you have is a sick soul in need of a spiritual experience, Jung once wrote, a sentence that echoes like a key unlocking the entire nature of addiction. It is not the substance or behavior itself that defines the addict. It is the hollow ache underneath it, the unspoken question, what am I really missing? Often, the addict cannot articulate what they are searching for. They only feel an annoying restlessness, a chronic dissatisfaction that eludes logic or language. The pain is existential, and so is the longing. And in that pain, they reach outward, toward alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, food, endless scrolling, hoping to fill what can only be healed from within. These objects of dependence become more than habits. They become false sacraments, temporary rituals through which the soul attempts to touch the sacred. But it is a substitute for meaning, for connection, for the inner union that the addict does not even know they've lost. What the addict truly longs for is not the substance, but a sense of inner coherence, a relationship with something greater, a union with a deeper meaning that transcends the limitations of the ego. Yet the relief they reach for, however potent, is fleeting. It dulls the pain for hours, perhaps days, before the original hollowness returns with renewed ferocity. And so the spiral continues, tightening, deepening, not out of weakness, but out of a soul that is starving. The more one clutches at the external, the further they drift from the internal axis of their suffering. Jung understood this spiral not as a failure of character, but as a spiritual hunger, a sacred yearning for truth, for unity, for self-reconciliation. Addiction, in this light, becomes the unconscious screaming for contact with the eternal. In ancient rites, the consumption of mind-altering substances was never casual. It was wrapped in ritual, protected by myth, and guided by elders. It was a portal to the divine, a descent into the symbolic cosmos to commune with the gods. Today, in a desacralized culture bereft of ritual and inward mythos, the modern addict unconsciously mimics this ancient pattern, but without the structure, without the symbol, without the soul. The same substance meant to expand the spirit now devours it, leading not to transcendence, but to collapse. Jung warned that man cannot survive by logic alone. He requires symbols, living images of the divine, to orient his psyche. When these inner symbols decay, when myth dies and is not replaced, the soul begins to fragment, and in this fragmentation, addiction emerges not as a moral error, but as a failed ritual, a broken initiation, a misguided attempt to restore sacredness in a world that no longer speaks its language. And when the soul is wounded, it does not bleed outward. It bleeds inward, searching blindly for a salve in whatever form it can grasp. Addiction, then, is not merely a habit or a vice. It is a symbolic cry for healing, an unconscious rite performed in the dark, a desperate attempt to mend what the psyche itself can no longer bear. In this light, the addict is not a transgressor of will, but a seeker of wholeness. Clumsy, yes, but legitimate in their search for relief. This is precisely why Jung's work casts such a long shadow over the birth of recovery movements like Alcoholics Anonymous. When Bill Wilson reached out to Jung, it was not for a clinical formula, but for something far deeper, a key to the soul. And Jung, with characteristic clarity, responded, The only true cure for addiction is a spiritual awakening, a profound inner transformation that reshapes the psychic landscape. Spiritus contra spiritum, he wrote, only spirit can conquer spirit, not laws, not discipline, but the birth of meaning, not suppression, but integration. From Jung's perspective, addiction is not a pathology to be eradicated. It is a message, a symptom of the soul's exile, a luminous signal flashing from the unconscious, calling the individual to descend, to look beneath the surface of symptoms and confront the deeper wound. And like all true crises, it carries within it the seed of metamorphosis. In this descent lies a potential, a sacred opportunity to reclaim what has been lost, not just abstained from a substance, but awakened to a forgotten self. Jung did not speak of curing the addict in the sterile sense of fixing a malfunction. He spoke of guiding them back to their inner center, to that vital flame buried beneath years of fear, denial, and despair. The suffering of the addict, as harrowing as it may be, reveals something astonishing, that within them still stirs a longing for the eternal, a yearning for something real, even if buried beneath guilt and confusion. That yearning is the ember of transformation. It is not punishment that awakens the soul. It is meaning, and meaning only emerges when the bottom is reached, not just externally, but internally, when the ego shatters and the deeper self begins to stir. Many addicts describe a void, an emptiness so vast they can't name it. And Jung, with his unparalleled insight, saw that this emptiness is not a lack of substance, but a fragmentation of the psyche itself. The addict is not craving a drug. They are yearning for reunion, with love, with safety, with their own soul. What they truly seek in the substance is not the substance, but what it symbolizes: wholeness, comfort, power, forgiveness, belonging. And in this light, we no longer see the addict as broken, but as someone on an archetypal path, a path not of indulgence, but of return, a path that, if embraced with consciousness, can lead not to destruction, but to awakening. Here we arrive at a core Jungian insight. Addiction is not merely a habit, it is a symbol. In the language of the soul, every symptom is a messenger. The psyche, when wounded, does not shout in logic. It whispers in symbols, in behaviors, in repetitions that seem irrational, but carry profound inner meaning. In Jung's view, addiction is not an accident of biology, nor a mere failure of will. It is a psychic message, a coded plea from the unconscious crying out for balance, integration, and wholeness. It reveals that something essential within the individual has been cast into exile, something that longs not to destroy, but to be understood. To pathologize the addict without seeking the symbolic message behind the pattern is to silence the very voice that might guide healing. Jung never asked us to excuse destructive behaviors, but he did teach us to look beneath them, to ask not, "What is wrong with you?" but "What is your suffering trying to say?" Seen through this lens, addiction becomes an archetypal narrative, not a moral defect. It is the wounded inner child seeking a lost parent, the dismembered soul yearning for reunion, the divine thirst misdirected toward earthly substitutes. Behind the self-destruction lies an ancient longing, a forgotten truth buried in the rubble of repression. For Jung, to dismiss this longing is to deny the humanity of the addict. He reminds us the wound is the place where the light enters, and the substance, the behavior, is only the outer symptom. The true work lies within. What the addict chases outside is often a reflection of what they were forced to abandon within, and so addiction becomes not only a trap, it becomes a compass. Misaligned, yes, but not meaningless. It points not toward pleasure, but toward unfulfilled need, toward wholeness that has yet to be realized. It is a cry for a spiritual experience, for a reconnection with the sacred center of one's being. But to respond to this cry, one must descend, not into shame, but into inquiry. The question is no longer, why are you addicted, but what are you truly seeking beneath this pain? When a person reaches again and again for relief, they do not understand. When they feel possessed by an inner force that moves without their consent, they are confronting the very face of the shadow. The shadow, as Jung taught, is not evil. It is everything we refuse to see in ourselves. It is the forgotten, the unwanted, the unacceptable. It contains our primal emotions, unmet needs, and ancient wounds, banished not because they are wicked, but because they threatened our adaptation, our image, our survival. Yet what is buried in the unconscious is never truly gone. It transforms. And when it is not welcomed consciously, it demands expression elsewhere, in compulsion, in craving, in collapse. But within that collapse, paradoxically, lies the doorway to awakening. For if the shadow is met with courage and compassion, it no longer sabotages. It begins to serve. One of the most common disguises the shadow wears is addiction, a symptom not of moral failure, but of profound psychic division. At the heart of every addictive pattern lies an inner war. On one side stands the persona, the outer mask, striving for control, success, acceptance, and the illusion of wholeness. On the other lies the hidden self, the wounded terrain of the psyche that carries unspoken grief, repressed rage, and long-forgotten sorrow. Rather than confront this buried anguish, the addict attempts to suppress it, to numb it into silence. But the shadow, as Jung taught us, cannot be banished without consequence. What is repressed does not fade into oblivion. It returns with greater force, demanding to be seen. And when ignored, it leaks into our actions, in moments of weakness, in self-sabotaging choices, in behaviors that mystify even the one acting them out. What makes this struggle even more insidious is that the addict often misidentifies the enemy. They believe the battle is against the substance, the temptation, or the external world. But in truth, the conflict is internal, a silent tug-of-war between the part of the self that seeks to express the pain and the part that fears it, judges it, and locks it away. This inner friction produces a deep psychic tension, an untraceable anxiety that gnaws at the soul and erodes one's sense of peace. Even when the substance is removed, the emptiness often remains. Irritability, depression, and confusion linger, not because the chemical dependency persists, but because the true wound has not been touched. The drug, the habit, the behavior, it was never the root. It was the symptom, a veil over the deeper cry. And so the shadow shifts forms, from alcohol to overwork, from sex to food, from narcotics to compulsive scrolling. The object changes, but the pattern repeats, because the inner split remains unhealed. Jung understood that shadow integration is not a task for the faint of heart. It demands courage, radical honesty, a willingness to peer into the mirror without distortion, to acknowledge those parts of the self that have been hidden, despised, or feared. It is not about blaming the outside world, nor about excusing harm, but about reclaiming authorship of one's life by bringing the unconscious into light. When a person begins this inner journey, they stop seeing addiction as a curse and begin to recognize it as a symbol, a messenger carrying urgent news from the depths of the soul. Something within needs attention. Something longs for understanding, not suppression. This perspective does not deny responsibility. It deepens it, because true transformation is not achieved by fighting symptoms, but by illuminating their source. And when the shadow is brought into consciousness, it no longer rules from the dark. The individual is no longer its captive, but its student. In this act of turning inward, something profound occurs. The compulsion loosens its grip. The behavior that once held so much power begins to lose its sacred role as the only source of relief. And in its place, a more intimate, honest relationship with the self begins to emerge, one where destructive impulses are no longer commands, but signals, and in hearing them, the healing begins. In many instances, addiction is the echo of a past not yet digested by the conscious mind. Traumas of abandonment, wounds of humiliation, silent hours of emotional starvation, these do not simply fade, they sink beneath awareness into the realm of the unconscious, where they ferment quietly, accumulating psychic tension. The shadow becomes their keeper. Even when the mind forgets, the soul remembers, and so the addict drinks, smokes, injects, consumes, not merely to escape, but to anesthetize the soul's unwept grief. Repetition becomes ritual, not as a conscious rebellion, but as an unconscious prayer, an invocation for numbness over memory. Yet the more one flees the forgotten pain, the more power it gains. What is not integrated turns to projection. The unclaimed shadow begins to stain the world around us. Friends become threats, love is mistrusted, life is interpreted through a lens of suspicion. And so the addict is caught in an illusion, not only of substance, but of perception. They see through a mirror cracked by exile from their own inner truth. This, Jung reminds us, is no longer merely a clinical matter, it is a spiritual initiation. For to face the shadow is to confront the sacred, to kneel before the unlit altar of the soul and say, I am ready to see what I once could not. This is not weakness, it is initiation. True healing cannot be imposed from the outside. It cannot be commanded through logic or imposed through will. It must arise from a courageous descent inward. The addict must become a traveler into their own psychic underworld, not to dwell in the darkness, but to converse with it, to ask, what have you come to teach me? In the Jungian view, the shadow is not merely darkness. It is potential, wrapped in pain. The gold is in the shadow. There, hidden beneath the debris of rejection and repression, lie lost capacities, raw feeling, instinctual wisdom, sacred anger-buried creativity. Shadow integration is the art of rescuing these exiled parts of the self, not to be ruled by them, but to welcome them into conscious wholeness. The addict begins to see not a broken self, but a divided one. And in that recognition, shame softens into understanding. What was once seen as weakness now becomes a map. The scar becomes a signpost. The addiction, no longer a sentence, becomes a summons to a deeper life. This path is not linear. It winds, it falters, it repeats. But through presence and compassion, something changes. A person begins to feel not just the pain, but the meaning of the pain. They begin to decipher the language of their suffering, and in doing so, a new kind of presence emerges, one that is not built on avoidance, but on truth. Not perfection, but integration. And from this inner alchemy, a more rooted, conscious, and powerful self takes form. Jung observed that those burdened by deep suffering did not always require explanations. They needed an inner experience, so symbolic, so soul-touching, that it could reorder the chaos within and breathe life back into their shattered center. Not an intellectual answer, but an encounter with the sacred. A moment of inward revelation that could rethread the broken narrative of their existence. This reordering often comes not through formal religion, but through a genuine spiritual encounter that awakens the feeling of belonging to something greater than the fragmented self. And this connection, Jung believed, was not an optional luxury. It was a necessity rooted in the very structure of the human psyche. In his clinical practice, Jung witnessed that those who could not access a symbolic relationship to the sacred remained trapped in cycles of suffering, repeating compulsions, not out of moral weakness, but because they lacked a deeper meaning powerful enough to carry them through transformation. Addiction, in this light, becomes a distorted longing for spiritual transcendence. It is a misguided attempt to dissolve the ego, to escape the unbearable weight of fragmentation, and to taste, even momentarily, a sense of unity. But when this yearning is directed toward substances or compulsions, the soul's hunger only deepens. The opposite of healing occurs, further division, greater inner exile. To transform, the psyche must encounter a symbol, potent enough to act as its new axis mundi, a central image, a dream, a vision that speaks not to the intellect, but to the soul. Such a symbol cannot be imposed from the outside. It arises from the inner world, often only after the person has faced the darkness with humility and chosen not to run. Only then does the unconscious reveal its hidden map, not longer a maze of despair, but a journey of meaning. Across all cultures, myths, archetypes, and rituals have existed because they serve this sacred function. They give suffering a context. They offer the soul a story where pain is not senseless, but initiatory. This is why the addict does not merely need abstinence. They need symbolic death, a letting go of the false identity they clung to for survival, and a rebirth into something more whole. And this rebirth is not achieved through force of will, but through surrender. Not to weakness, but to the inner process, to the silent intelligence of the soul. In that surrender, the symbolic begins to speak. Fire is no longer just destruction, it becomes purification. Darkness is no longer an enemy, it becomes fertile ground. What was once unbearable becomes bearable, not because it is less painful, but because it now carries meaning. And where there is meaning, there is strength. Spiritual or therapeutic support may guide the path, but it cannot manufacture the symbol. It can only help prepare the psyche to receive it. The true alchemy happens in stillness, in the invisible moment when the soul chooses not to flee, but to feel. In that moment, what once seemed like a narrative of failure is transfigured into a myth of redemption. Suffering becomes a sacred teacher, pain becomes a portal, and addiction, once seen as a curse, becomes the wounded cry of the soul seeking rebirth. For it is, as Jung once reminded us, only the wounded physician heals, and perhaps the addict, through the very wound they carry, holds the seed of profound transformation, if only they can find the courage to listen. As that seed begins to take root within the psyche, it does not simply change what one does, it alters how one sees. The individual no longer identifies with their wounds as if they were their only name. Instead, they begin to see themselves through the mirror of transcendence, as a being capable not merely of surviving the wound, but of transfiguring it. No longer drawn toward numbness, they move toward presence. No longer haunted by the desire to disappear, they step fully into the arena of their own becoming, and in this sacred participation with life, suffering is no longer viewed as punishment. It becomes initiation. The addict, once cast as a passive character bound to repetition, now reclaims authorship of their own myth, a journey not away from darkness, but through it toward wholeness. In this transformation, pain becomes wisdom. The shadow ceases to be a feared adversary and emerges instead as a guide, and the symbol, no longer a distant idea, becomes lived reality, a sacred container through which spirit incarnates in daily experience. This is not a spirituality that escapes the body or the world. It is one that descends into it more fully, infusing presence into each moment, sanctifying the ordinary. Healing, from this Jungian vantage, is not a return to how things were. It is a birth. Something never known before emerges from the soil of descent, a form of life that could only grow through the crucible of the abyss. The symbol is not an intellectual accessory. It is the doorway to a deeper reality, a world in which self-understanding becomes reconciliation with the past, with the pain, and ultimately with the sacred possibility of one's own freedom. When the symbol has germinated in the soul, life no longer revolves around avoidance, but around awareness. It was always space, a holy womb where something authentic could finally be conceived. Addiction, then with all its chaos, shame, and longing, becomes the fractured language of a soul, crying out to be seen, and when that cry is met with genuine attention, with the kind of listening that does not judge, does not fix, but simply witnesses, the compulsion to escape begins to dissolve. Wholeness does not require perfection. It requires truth. The courage to face oneself not with violence, but with compassion. The healing of the addict is not forgetting nor erasing. It is remembering that even in their darkest hour, a seed of light was already buried within. Carl Jung did not offer solutions in the modern sense. He offered initiation, a symbolic pathway by which each soul might encounter its own myth. For at the heart of every addiction lies a plea for meaning, and at the core of every redemption, a reconciliation with the mystery of being human. That is where the true journey begins, not when the pain ends, but when it is no longer feared, when the silence beneath suffering becomes the place where freedom at last begins to rise. If something within this message stirred you, if even a single word mirrored your inner experience, I invite you to let your voice be heard in the comments. Have you encountered that soul whose presence feels like home, or are you still walking the sacred path back to yourself? Your story, however unfinished, may become the lantern in someone else's darkness, the very sign they didn't know they were searching for. And if someone close to you is silently struggling with the illusion that love must hurt, that self-abandonment is the price of connection, or that they are unworthy of peace, share this video with them. Help me reach the ones who need to remember real love does not demand that we shrink. True connection does not ask for sacrifice of the soul. And the most vital union we will ever form is the one with our own inner truth. Before you go, I invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Here in this space, we journey beneath the surface of things, exploring the hidden architecture of the psyche, the whispers of the unconscious, and how every relationship is but a mirror reflecting our personal evolution. If there's a theme, a question, or a wound you would like us to explore in future videos, leave it below. This space breathes because of you. Your voice is not only welcome here, it is essential. Thank you for showing up, not just to this video, but to your inner work, to the sacred labor of remembering who you truly are. And always remember this, when the right person appears, your soul will know, not through fear, but through peace. But until that moment, let your most intimate relationship be the one you cultivate within. That is the foundation. That is the home. And from that wholeness, all things real are born. Until next time, I'll see you on the path.